Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
In 1931, Matthew Williams was lynched in Salisbury, Maryland. But despite the long years, have we really come to grips with its legacy? Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. There is no plaque where Matthew Williams was lynched in Salisbury, and a controversy continues to swirl around the historical marker that notes a Confederate general who oversaw Union prisoners during the Civil War. It is a complex legacy that still haunts the community on its outer edges, just out of sight. Next month, the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project and the Lily Carroll Jackson Civil Rights Museum will hold a conference in Baltimore. It will take place at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum and is entitled Lynching in Maryland, Journey from Truth to Reconciliation. In our studio this morning is James Yamakawa, who has been involved in the vigils for Matthew Williams and has volunteered his time for the project. And also on the phone is Dr. Nicholas Creary. He's an assistant professor at Bowie State University. And welcome to the program.
Good morning.
So I want to start with you, James, and because I start with this idea that we have this issue of Matthew Williams. Describe for us a little bit about, obviously, what happened to him and what you think the significance is in terms of this community.
Well, Matthew Williams was a young black man in Salisbury in 1933. He was 23 years old. He worked for a local lumberyard owner named Daniel Elliott, and stories differ depending on who you talk to. The official story is that there was a wage dispute, and that Matthew Williams shot his employer, Daniel Elliott. Other stories included the fact that, it was actually Daniel Elliott's son who borrowed money from Matthew Williams, and Matthew Williams went to his employer, who was a friend of the family, to get this matter settled, and that the son actually shot both of them. Well, what is known for sure is that Matthew Williams was injured in whatever happened, taken to Peninsula General Hospital, which is now PRMC. He was abducted by a mob of maybe about 100 men out of the hospital, taken to the courthouse lawn, where upwards of 1,000 residents took part in hanging him from a tree just outside the courthouse. And his body was then dragged through the black neighborhoods of Salisbury and then set on fire. And yeah, that's pretty much what happened.
And of course, what the irony is, of course, is that the black community, which was just right nearby, could actually look down and see this.
Yes. And the choice of taking his body, the dragging it on a truck through the neighborhoods was intentional. There were black wait staff at the Wacomico Hotel that were forced to watch the lynching, and the point was it's a public spectacle, but it's also an act of racial control. Basically saying to the black residents, we technically don't own you, but we're going to do what we want to with you.
Now, you've been obviously involved with an archaeological project, and you've discovered another person who appears to have been killed during the same time.
That was actually jointly between local historian Linda Dwyer and the folks at the Equal Justice Initiative. There was a man, I don't know the age, and we don't know the name, obviously. Just in the days after Matthew Williams, there was kind of an informal curfew of the black community. They're saying, just don't go out at night at all. And this man needed groceries. They found his body up by the railroad tracks in Salisbury. Basically, his head beaten in. They knew he was going to get groceries because they found a brown paper bag with half a ham in it. He had gone out to get food. Because no one can go out, and people obviously still wanted blood, so a group found him and beat his brains in. And it was so the Equal Justice Initiative down in Montgomery, Alabama, actually has unknown on one of the steel memorial columns in the National Memorial now. And so officially, there are 3 recorded lynchings in Salisbury. There may be more, obviously, that we don't know about.
I want to turn to you, Dr. Query, and move back in time a bit to the beginning of lynchings, and in terms of their proliferation, which I understand really take place after the Tilden Rutherford B. Hayes agreement, the end of construction. Tell me a little bit about that beginning.
Well, sure. I mean, we do have documented cases of lynching going back to as early as 1854. Again, on the Eastern Shore, that would have been David Thomas, who was lynched in Denton in Caroline County. And again, I mean, there were a few there, but several, most of the cases of lynching, as you said, do begin to really pick up in terms of larger numbers, after Reconstruction. There are several during the Reconstruction period on both sides of the bay. But the larger number of them do really begin to take up after 1877. And as James was saying, I mean, these were basically terror lynchings. Lynchings that were meant to keep blacks in their place. As he said, I mean, sort of the idea was that they may not own blacks anymore, but they specifically wanted to keep them in their place of subservience. I was just going back over the information about Garfield King, the first lynching that happened in Wicomico County, and in the wake of that lynching, because he was alleged to have murdered a white person, somebody from the community, I believe it was Allen, wrote a letter which in part said, let's be clear, this is a white man's county, and Negroes just do not have any hope of leadership or of being able to rise and do anything for themselves. So I mean, this is very much part of not just the Eastern Shore, but it was very much across the state of Maryland. And again, it sort of cinches for me, the argument that Maryland was and still is in many ways a southern state, even though it didn't secede from the Union during the war. It acted in very, very southern ways, particularly in the way it went about lynching and using violence as a means to maintain control over the African American communities.
One of the quotes I ran across in observation of this was that the lynching basically was an act that was turned into a symbolic rite in which the black victim became really representative of his race. That's a warning as to the black population not to challenge white supremacy. Indeed, what is suggested here is that it wasn't even so much the individual crime or alleged crime or incident or whatever it is that they justified by it, but rather it became much greater than that for the white community.
Yeah, very much so. This was all about white supremacy, and again, trying to maintain black people in so-called in quote in their place. If an African American person was too successful as a business person, was starting to make more money than whites, that was seen as a threat. In many cases. Again, I think of, one of the cases that happened in Prince George's County where somebody was lynched for allegedly arson, sort of allegedly burning the tobacco, barns of several people in Prince George's County. There's a real possibility that these people were, the Vermillion family was being rather successful and was doing at least as well, if not better, than some of the local farmers. And so, yes, they lynched, Joe Vermillion, perhaps because they were being, too economically successful. Not all of the lynchings had to do with attempted, assault or, some sort of sexual relationship with white women. In fact, in most cases outside of Maryland, more often than not, lynchings usually happened because black people were either economically successful or, said the wrong thing or got into it with white folks for some reason. And it didn't take much of a reason to get a lynch mob up and active, back in the day.
The thing that strikes me is that this seemed to unite all strata in terms of economics, whether you were poor, white, whether you were middle class, and so on.
Yes, very much so. And that's where, as I said, the ultimate end of the day, it was, to support and maintain the ideology of white supremacy. Even, to the perfunctory, sort of after the lynching, almost inevitably you had in the papers, people saying, oh, well, this is a terrible thing. This was a travesty of justice. They should have let, the legal system run its course. But there was no real attempt at remorse or saying, we could have prevented this. It's usually, oh, darn, the sheriff could have done a better job, but they ultimately, exonerate him because, well, it was a big mob. He was overpowered. So yes, and that's the key thing about lynching is, it's a community that's involved in that was involved in it. It wasn't just, that's what makes it different from just straight up murder. This was community. This was coordinated, planned, the silence, the code of silence associated with it, along with the concomitant silencing of the victim community. That's what makes this such a truly heinous crime.
James, picking up on that, there is this idea that there is an epidemic of silence, that it infected residents, and no one wanted to speak out for fear of implicating their neighbors, much less, I suppose, betraying their neighbors. There seems to be that. Not only is there obviously the emphasis on trying to control the black population, but it also controls the white population as well.
Well, when you if you take the estimate of about 1,000 people for Matthew Williams lynching, that's like 10% of the town. That's a significant, number of people. Chances are, if you were not in that crowd, you knew someone or were very closely related to someone who was in that crowd. No one wants to, assignate blame to their neighbor for what they're doing. I guess that's a human impulse. But the silence afterwards, it's meant just as much to control the white population as well, saying like that there's no way you can ever find atonement for this act because you're not allowed to talk about it, and that's they talk about a lot about psychological damage. Obviously the damage and the violence against the African American community is obviously the prime point of this. No one's debating that,
right.
But there is a simultaneous damage to the white community as well, psychologically and culturally. When you are, even if you're not part of this mob, and actually, in a lot of the larger lynch mobs in the South, children and families were obviously involved. They were required to take part. I don't know if there were children in this mob, but if there were, they were tangentially related. You're basically taught that these people's lives don't matter, that you are required to keep that silence, and how does that psychologically affect you in the future? You're going to grow up knowing that that this violence is acceptable and that it kind of dehumanizes them permanently in your mind. There's psychological studies that kind of show that it does have an effect on the white community as well. And I probably still dealing with that nationally, the results of that in our culture.
Just to follow up quickly on that, I do believe that it was in the Matthew Williams case that a high school football team, and I don't remember exactly from where, but there was a high school football team, staying in the hotel across the street from where his body was burned, and they were apparently there and watching. So yes,
right.
There were children there.
I think it was Wicomico High School or Salisbury High School, and the team from Delmarva. They were having dinner at the restaurant or hotel, and so we're at least teenagers. Thank you. I completely forgot about that.
And then the other thing, in terms of the damage, the significance of and again, it goes back to the conspiracy, within the community, because in every case, in Maryland that I've seen, After the body's taken down, and that they convene a jury of inquest, and inevitably the ruling is the same. This person met his death at the hands of parties unknown. Now, never mind the fact that particularly in the Garfield King case, the Baltimore Sun is very clear in stating that the members of the lynch mob did not have masks on their face. They made no attempt or effort to hide their identities in any way. And yet everybody, who testified before the jury of inquest said, nope, we didn't see anybody. We couldn't see. It wasn't possible to make out, their faces because it was so darkly lit. That's conspiracy. I mean, we can talk about the psychological damage and, the damage to the white community, but that, shows the complicity of the legal system, in covering for the people who engaged in this crime.
Well, one of the things I was struck by as I've been looking around are photographs in which not only obviously you have the person who's been lynched, but then you have this large number of people who are out looking at the camera as if, I don't know whether they're proud, or what do you make of those images? That they didn't hide behind hoods, that they were actually preserved for all time.
Yeah, I think it speaks to, again, the level of racism and the degree to which that violence against black people was normalized. This was seen as an entirely acceptable form of behavior. The protests, to the contrary, notwithstanding, yes, as you said, I think they took great pride in that, and they weren't trying to hide from it, which, again, I think says a lot more about where, sort of the American mindset and the American psyche was vis-a-vis race relations. And yes, we can say we've come a long way, happily. We're not seeing these kinds of, forms of violence happening anymore, but I still wonder, again, you look at Charlottesville, you look at, sort of those explicit, statements of racist ideology. That's not too far removed from, the people who were, as you said, sort of facing the camera with pride, and look at what we've done here.
James, I want to, here in Salisbury, this lynching, and I'm sure probably in other communities as well, seems to be an intimate affair in the sense that you have both communities who are living basically side by side. Matter of fact, the African American community actually extended much further towards downtown, which of course now have been wiped out by the major highways. And after it all, the dust settles, the bodies removed, black people and white people then have to go back to interacting with one another, whether it's maids, whether it's somebody who at a store. What about that intimacy that you see in a small town, particularly like this?
Well, lynching is a brutal act, but it's also like any violence, it is intimate is the only word I can think. You're right, intimate, because it's person on person. People were standing not like a foot from Matthew Williams and Garfield King, and this unknown man that was lynched right after that. You can't beat someone's head in without being right there. But going back to the people working together, obviously, some of those people that the maids would go into the houses, they may have been part of the mob, they may not have been, but the idea is that they're still complicit in it. I can only imagine that everyone knew exactly who was doing this, and I honestly, it's impossible. Not impossible, but it's incredible to think that you can go in and back into work like that. But I guess if you had to, you had to. So, but the going back to the idea of complicity, it's as much the people kind of low-key keeping that silence and low-key so yeah, these are obvious acts of violent racism, but they're held up by the smaller acts of silence. Again, I don't even really think the silence in this case was really small. It's big. It was a community-wide conspiracy essentially, but it's held up by small acts each day.
Yeah, and again, I would think that for people who, in effect, from the black community who survived the lynching, as it were, to know, if you were a maid going into somebody's house and you knew that your employer was part of the mob or was, a bystander in the mob and did nothing or cheered it on. I mean, psychologically, I can't even begin to imagine what that must do to a person psychologically. But I mean, to instill that fear, and I think that's one of those key elements, to instill the fear so that, you can't even begin to think about wanting to do something for yourself or to stand up for yourself in a significant way. That I think is the really chilling part, and again, if we're talking about this in terms of, the intimacy within a community, and yet, in the midst of all of that, to have, because again, the other thing that happens frequently and certainly happened in the wake of the Garfield King lynching in 1898, the black communities would come together and have, indignation meetings, and again, the fact that they developed a term, that they were speaking out against it, saying this is wrong, this is an injustice against us as a community, and they're calling on, state government officials to investigate and to provide some sort of redress. Again, speaks, I would say, the heroism of these black communities. That in the midst of all of that, and in that context, that they got together, in their churches, and they, made speeches and made these petitions, and all of this was carried in the local and the papers and the Baltimore Sun. So again, white folks had to have known that black folk were doing this. That's nothing short of heroic in my book.
Let me ask you then, Professor, we get a decline somewhere around in the 1920s, beginning decline of this particular form of violence, that is lynching. Why does it decline? Because by the time we get to the 1930s, you can see that it is dissipating. What brought that about?
Well, first of all, the Equal Justice Initiative, in their report says that you can trace that, there's a direct correlation between decline in lynchings and a significant increase in executions. And so there's really not as great a need for lynching because the machinery of the state, gets involved and begins to try and execute people in relatively quick fashion. So lynching and maybe that was the state's response to, as their way to try to deal with, the problem of lynching. And so, this is where, again, sort of this notion of black criminality and, the association of blacks with crime, really comes to a fore during this period. Now, the other thing, in particular to Maryland, is that, yes, between 1911 and 1931, there are no documented cases of lynching. That doesn't mean that there weren't cases of lynching that happened in that 20-year span. We just don't have any record of it. I would be willing to wager, if somebody went out there and started doing some oral history, you could probably find some instances of lynchings that happened somewhere in the state of Maryland between 1911 and 1931. I'd be willing to bet my next paycheck that you could find that. But again, that research hasn't been done, but I'd be willing to say. So, I think it's the state stepping in and executing people, for these alleged crimes for which others would have been lynched is why you have the significant decrease in lynching happening during the first part of the 20th century.
Well, in some of my research, there seems to be some kind of shift that goes on in terms of public opinion It indicated, for instance, the Dyer anti-lynching bill, which passed the House but obviously was killed in the Senate with a filibuster, came to the fore. Long discussion about the importance. We had some, I guess, the Southern white organizations, some of them condemned it. I think the Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching. There seems to be some, around this period of time, there does seem to be a shift in public sentiment.
Well, yes, because at this point, the lynching and, sort of the South is becoming an embarrassment to the nation. Here we see, and again, this gets picked up, certainly, especially during the Cold War, but, it becomes very difficult for the United States to say, yes, we're the great democracy, we're the land of the free and the home of the brave, and then, the Soviet Union and communists and other organizations say, yeah, but look at how you treat your black people in the South. And so, yes, there is, an attempt to try to curb that. As I said, because, it's becoming an embarrassment. And so, yes, there was. We did have the Dyer anti-lynching bill. There was even an attempt, I think it was in 1898, 1899. One of the delegates in the Maryland House of Delegates from Bel Air introduced, an anti-lynching bill. It didn't get out of committee, but even in Maryland there was an attempt. So I think there was a move away from this, and I think the involvement of the state moving towards swift trials and swift executions may well have been a part of that sort of broader move to try to stem some of the embarrassment that the South was causing the nation as a whole.
James, you've obviously been involved with trying to take the community's attention towards at least Matthew Williams and the lynching. We obviously had also the controversy over the Confederate general who, as I mentioned a moment ago, oversaw the Union prisons. And there's a plaque there. There's a protest against taking that plaque down. No move yet to put any plaque there for Matthew Williams. What do you make of how this community in the present day comes to grips with this, and the fact that we mentioned before began the show that we're not more than a generation or two away from the people who were involved, and so that we know that there are people in this community whose relatives probably were there, if not involved directly?
One of the arguments that people made against the removal of the Winder marker from the courthouse lawn was that it was an act of erasing history. That argument can be made 1,000 times and still be incorrect. It's not history. It's an inaccurate history at best. One of the arguments that I would make for having the community memorialize Matthew Williams, Garfield King, and this unknown man would be that this is history that actually belongs there. And this history actually belongs to our community. It is not pleasant history, obviously, but it's vital because it has shaped our community in itself. The people don't want to talk. Does anyone really want to talk about things that are uncomfortable, that may shine a bad light on us and our community? I can understand people wouldn't want to do that, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't happen. It means it's more important that it does. So I'm really not sure what else to say about that.
Well, let me yeah, go ahead, Doctor.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the other thing, yes, we know, something like 60,000 Marylanders ended up joining the Confederate Army, but constitutionally, the only crime that's defined in the U.S. Constitution is treason, and so if we're putting up a plaque to memorialize and to remember these people who joined the Confederate Army, we're celebrating traitors. We're remembering people who engaged in acts of treason against the United States, particularly for Marylanders, because Maryland never seceded from the Union. Now, yes, and Lincoln put them under martial law, but at the end of the day, we are memorializing treason and slavery. That to me is unconscionable.
And not to mention the fact that the winder marker being on the courthouse lawn where two of these men were lynched is sort of another way of driving the knife further into the black community, saying, yes, you don't matter because we're going to have this here.
Dr. Kern, let me ask you one final question. It's a question that's come to my mind since I've been here, and that is whether or not the nation, obviously as a whole, but the South in particular, has ever come to grips with the legacy of slavery, that we never had that moment. The Germans, obviously, after the Second World War, had their moment. We don't seem to have had that moment yet. Or maybe we're going through that now. I don't know.
No, we haven't had that moment yet. And I would take it one step further and, let's not absolve the North, because there were plenty of lynchings that happened in border states that were technically northern states too. No, I would say going back to the beginning, race is the fundamental original sin of this nation, and we have not, dealt with it or addressed it in any meaningful way, particularly since the Civil War. Like Sherilyn Ifill, I would argue we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or a Truth and Reconciliation process because there cannot be reconciliation until we have the truth. And that means we have to recognize and acknowledge, as James was saying, that unpleasant truth, that lynching was a significant part of our history, North and South, and that nothing was done to try to address that or redress that. Again, speaks to, volumes to how little we've done and how much farther we still have to go.
We've been speaking with James Yamakawa, who has been involved in the vigils for Matthew Williams, also involved with the project, the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, that will be holding a new conference in Baltimore next month. And also on the phone with us is Dr. Nicholas Creary. He's assistant professor at Bowie State University. Appreciate you both of you joining us this morning.
Thank you very much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14.